You're listening to Word Crimes.
Welcome to Title 18, Word Crimes. I'm Eric Arneson. On this episode, Mary Wilson reads Autumn at the Automat by Lawrence Block, a story from the anthology In Sunlight or in Shadow, a collection of short stories inspired by the paintings of Edward Hopper.
It seemed to her that some of her fellow diners could feel it when he stared at them, shifting uncomfortably without consciously knowing why.
Lawrence Block is one of my literary heroes. He's published more than 100 books, including novels, great novels, about Keller, a hitman who collects stamps, about Matthew Scudder, a cop-turned-private investigator, and about Bernie Rhodenbarr, a gentleman burglar, among many others. His nonfiction books about writing are outstanding. Lawrence Block is a Grand Master of the Mystery Writers of America. He has won the Edgar and Shamus Awards 4 times each, the Japanese Maltese Falcon Award twice, and the Nero, Wolfe, and Philip Marlowe Awards. Among his many other recognitions is the Edward D. Hoch Memorial Golden Derringer for lifetime achievement in the short story, and they are all well-deserved. Plus, Lawrence Block rides the train whenever possible. The man is cool, and his writing is amazing. I could go on, but I think you'd rather hear the story. So here's Mary Wilson reading Autumn at the Automat by Lawrence Block, originally published in the anthology In Sunlight or in Shadow.
Autumn at the Automat by Lawrence Block. The hat made a difference. If you chose your clothes carefully, if you dressed a little more stylishly than the venue demanded, you could feel good about yourself. When you walked into the 42nd Street cafeteria, the hat and coat announced that you were a lady. Perhaps you preferred their coffee to what they served at Longchamp's, or maybe it was the bean soup, as good as you could get at Delmonico's. Certainly it wasn't abject need that led you to the cashier's window at Horn and Hardart. No one watching you dip into an alligator handbag for a $1 bill could think so for a minute. The nickels came back, 4 groups of 5. No need to count them, because the cashier did this and nothing else all day long, taking dollars, dispensing nickels. This was the automat, and the poor girl was the next thing to an automaton. You took your nickels and assembled your meal. You chose a dish, put your nickels in the slot, turned the handle, opened the little window, and retrieved your prize. A single nickel got you a cup of coffee. 3 more bought a bowl of the legendary bean soup, and another secured a little plate holding a seeded roll and a pat of butter. You carried your tray to the counter, moving very deliberately, positioning yourself in front of the compartmented metal tray of silverware. The moment you walked through the door, you knew which table you wanted. Of course, someone could have taken it, but no one did. Now, after a long moment, you carried your tray to it. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful of the bean soup, glad she'd decided against making do with a cup for the sake of saving a nickel. Not that she hadn't considered it. A nickel was nothing much, but if she saved a nickel twice a day, why, that came to $3 a month. More, really. $36.50 a year, and that was something. But she couldn't scrimp. Well, she could, in fact. She had to. But not when it came to nourishing herself. What was that expression Alfred had used? Kishkegeld. Belly money. Money saved by cheating one's stomach. She could hear him speak the words, could see the curl of his lip. Better, surely, to spend the extra nickel. Not for fear of Alfred's contempt. He was beyond knowing or caring what she ate or what it cost her. Unless, as she alternately hoped and feared, it didn't all stop with the end of life. Suppose that fine mind, that keen intelligence, that wry humor, suppose it had survived on some plane of existence even when all the rest of him had gone into the ground. She didn't really believe it, but sometimes it pleased her to entertain the notion. She'd even talk to him, sometimes aloud, but more often in the privacy of her mind. There was little she hadn't been able to share with him in life, and now his death had washed away what few conversational inhibitions she'd had. She could tell him anything now, and when it pleased her, she could invent answers for him and fancy she heard them. Sometimes they came so swiftly, and with such unsparing candor that she had to wonder at their source. Was she making them up? Or was he no less a presence in her life for having left it? Perhaps he hovered just out of sight, a disembodied guardian angel, watching over her, taking care of her. And no sooner did she have the thought than she heard the reply. Watching is as far as it goes, Liebchen. When it comes to taking care, you're on your own. She broke the roll in two, spread butter on it with the little knife, put the buttered roll on the plate, took up the spoon, took a spoonful of soup, then another, and then a bite of the roll. She ate slowly, using the time to scan the room. Just over half the tables were occupied. 2 women here, 2 men there, a man and woman who looked to be married, and another pair, at once animated but awkward with each other, whom she guessed were on a first or second date. She might have amused herself by making up a story about them, but let her attention pass them by. The other tables held solitary diners, more men than women, and most of them with newspapers. Better to be here than outside, as the city slipped deeper into autumn and the wind blew off the Hudson. Drink a cup of coffee, read the news or Mirror, pass the time. The manager wore a suit. So did most of the male patrons, but his looked to be of better quality and more recently pressed. His shirt was white, his necktie of a muted color she couldn't identify from across the room. She watched him out of the corner of her eye. Alfred had taught her to do this. Your eyes looked straight in front of you, and you didn't move them around to study the subject of your interest. Instead, you used your mind, telling it to pay attention to something on the periphery of your vision. It took practice, but she'd had plenty of that. She remembered a lesson in Penn Station, across from the left luggage window. While she kept her eyes trained on the man checking his suitcase, Alfred had quizzed her on passengers queuing for the Philadelphia train. She described them in turn and glowed when he praised her. The manager, she noted now, had a small, thin-lipped mouth. His wingtip shoes were brown and buffed to a high polish, and even as she observed him without looking at him, he studied his patrons in quite the opposite manner, his gaze moving deliberately, aggressively, from one table to the next. It seemed to her that some of her fellow diners could feel it when he stared at them, shifting uncomfortably without consciously knowing why. She had prepared herself, but when his eyes found her, she couldn't keep from drawing a breath, barely resisting the impulse to swing her eyes toward his. Her face darkened. She could feel it change expression, and when she reached for her coffee cup, she could feel the tremor in her hand. There he stood, beside the door to the kitchen, his hands clasped behind his back, his visage stern. There he stood, observing her directly, while she observed him, as she'd been taught. There he was. With just a little effort, she managed to take a sip of coffee without spilling any of it. Then she returned the cup to the saucer and took another breath. What did she suppose he had seen? She thought of a half-remembered poem, one they'd read in English class, something about wishing for the power to see oneself as one was seen by others. But what was the poem and who was its author? What the restaurant manager would have seen, she thought, was a small and unobtrusive woman of a certain age, wearing good clothes that were themselves of a certain age, a decent hat that had largely lost its shape, an Arnold Constable coat, worn at the cuffs, with one of its original bone buttons replaced with another that didn't quite match, good shoes, plain black pumps, her alligator bag, both well-crafted, of good leather, both purchased from good Fifth Avenue shops, and both showing their age, as indeed she was, like everything she owned. What would he have seen? The very picture of shabby gentility, she thought. And while she could not quite embrace the label, neither could she take issue with it. If her garments were shabby, they nevertheless announced unequivocally that their owner was genteel. The man at the table immediately to her right, dark suit, gray fedora, napkin tucked into his collar to shield his tie, was alternating between sips of his coffee and forkfuls of his dessert, which looked to be apple crisp. She'd given no thought to dessert, and now a glimpse of it ignited the desire. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had their apple crisp, but she remembered how it tasted. Perfect balance of tart and sweet, the crisp part all sugary and crunchy. They didn't always have apple crisp, which argued for her having a portion now when it was available. It wouldn't cost her more than 3 nickels, 4 at most, and she still had 15 of the 20 nickels the cashier had supplied. All she had to do was walk to the dessert section at the far right and claim her prize. No, because her cup of coffee was almost gone, and she'd want a fresh cup to accompany her dessert. And that would only cost a single nickel more, and she could afford that even as she could afford the dessert itself. But even so, the answer was no. The word again, in Alfred's voice this time. You are stalling, Knödelmaus. It's not the pleasure of the sweet that lures you. It's the desire to postpone that which you fear. She had to smile. If some corner of her own imagination was supplying Alfred's dialogue, it was doing so with great skill. Knödelmaus had been one of his pet names for her, but he had used it infrequently, and it hadn't crossed her conscious mind in ages. Yet there it was, in his voice, bracketed with English words, full of the flavor of the Kudam. You know me too well, she said, speaking the words only in her mind. And she waited for what he might say next, but nothing more came. He was done for now. Well, he'd said what he had to say. And he was right, wasn't he? Robert Burns, she thought, a Scotsman, writing in dialect sure to baffle high school students, and she'd lost the rest of the poem, but the one couplet had come back to her. Oh, I'd some power the giftie gie us, to see ourselves as others see us. But really, she wondered, would anyone in her right mind really want such a power? The gray man with the gray fedora put down his fork and freed his napkin from his collar, using it to swipe the crumbs of his apple crisp from his lips. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and moved to push back his chair. But then he changed his mind and returned to his newspaper. She fancied she could read his mind. The restaurant was not full, and no one was waiting for his table. He'd given them quite enough money for his chicken pot pie and his coffee and his apple crisp to keep his table as long as he wanted it. They didn't rush you here. They seemed to recognize that they were selling not just food, but shelter as well, and it was warm here and cold outside, and it's not as though anyone were waiting for him in his little room, or for her in hers. She lived a 10-minute walk away, in a residential hotel on East 28th Street. Her room was tiny, but still a good value at $5 a week, $20 a month. She'd long ago positioned a doily on the nightstand to hide the cigarette burn that was a legacy of a previous tenant, and hung framed illustrations from magazines to cover the worst water stains on the walls. There was a carpet on the floor, sound, if threadbare, and downstairs the lobby furniture might have seen better days, but didn't that make it a good match for the residents? Shabby genteel. 2 tables away, a woman about her age spooned sugar into her half-finished cup of coffee. Free nourishment, she thought. The sugar bowl was on the table, and you could make your coffee as sweet as you wished. The manager, who watched everything, no doubt registered every spoonful, but didn't seem to object. When she'd first begun drinking coffee, she took plenty of cream and sugar. Alfred had changed that, teaching her to take it black and unsweetened, and now that was the only way she could drink it. Not that the man had lacked a sweet tooth. He'd had a favorite place in Yorkville, with pastries he proclaimed the equal of Vienna's Café de Mel, and paired his Punschkrapfen or Linzer Tort with strong black coffee. You must have the contrast, Liebchen, the bitter with the sweet. One taste strengthens the other, at the table as in the world. His words were strongly accented now. One taste strengthens the other. When she'd met him, he was new in the country, but even then his English held just a trace of Middle Europe, and within a year or two he'd polished away the last of it. He'd allowed it to return only when it was just the two of them, as if she alone was permitted to hear where he'd come from. And it was when he talked about the past, about times in Berlin and Vienna, that it was strongest. She took a last sip of coffee. It wasn't the equal to the strong dark brew he'd taught her to prefer, but it was certainly more than acceptable. Did she want another cup? Without shifting her gaze, she allowed herself another visual scan of the room, saw the manager look at her and then away, studied the woman whom she'd seen adding sugar to her coffee. A woman dressed much as she was dressed, with a decent hat and a well-cut dove gray coat, neither of them new. A woman whose hair was graying and whose forehead showed worry lines, but whose mouth was still full-lipped and generous. Now the woman was looking at her, studying her without knowing she was being studied in return. Pick an ally, Schatzi. They come in handy. She let her eyes move to meet the woman's, noted her embarrassment at the contact, and eased it with a smile. The woman smiled back and then turned her attention to her coffee cup. And, contact established, she picked up her own cup. It was empty, but no one could know that, and she took a little sip of nothing at all. "You are stalling, Knoodle Mouse." Well, yes, she was. It was warm in here and cold out there, but it would only grow colder as afternoon edged into evening. It wasn't the wind or the air temperature that made her reluctant to leave her table. It was the 4th of the month, and her rent had been due on the 1st. She'd been late before, and knew that nobody would say anything until she was a week overdue. So there'd be a reminder in 3 days, a gentle advisory delivered with a gentle smile, directing her attention to what was surely an oversight. She didn't know what the next step would be, or when it would come. So far, that single reminder had achieved the desired effect, and she'd found the money and paid the monthly rental a day after it had been requested. That time she'd pawned a bracelet, 3 stones, carnelian and lapis and citrine, half-round oval cabochons set in yellow gold. Thinking of it now, she looked down at her bare wrist. It had been a gift of Alfred's, but that had been true of every piece of jewelry she'd owned. The bracelet was evidently her favorite, as it had been the last to make the trip to the pawn shop. She'd told herself she'd redeem it when the opportunity presented itself. She went on believing this until the day she sold the pawn ticket. And by then she'd grown accustomed to no longer owning the bracelet, so the pain was muted. We get used to things, Liebchen. A man can get used to hanging. Could anyone speak those lines convincingly, other than with the inflection of a Berliner? And you are still stalling. She put her handbag on the table, then was taken by a fit of coughing. She put her napkin to her lips, took a breath, coughed again. She didn't look, but knew people were glancing in her direction. She took a breath, managed not to cough. She was still holding her napkin, and now she picked up each of her utensils in turn, the soup spoon, the coffee spoon, the fork, the butter knife. She wiped them all thoroughly and placed each of them in her handbag, and fastened the clasp. Now she did look around and let something show on her face. She got to her feet. Not for the first time she felt a touch of dizziness upon standing. She put a hand on the table for support, and the dizziness subsided, as it always did. She drew a breath, turned, and walked toward the door. She moved at a measured pace, deliberately, neither hurrying nor slowing. This automat, unlike the one closer to her hotel, had a brass-trimmed revolving door, and she paused to let a new patron enter the restaurant. She thought about the desk clerk at her hotel and the $20. Her purse held a $5 bill and 2 singles, along with those 15 nickels, so she could pay a week's rent and have a few days to find the rest. And, "Oh, I don't think so. Stop right there, ma'am." She extended a foot toward the revolving door, and now a hand fastened on her upper arm. She spun around, and there he was, the thin-lipped manager. "Bold as brass," he said. "By God, you're not the first person to walk off with the odd spoon, but you took the lot, didn't you? And polished them while you were at it. How dare you?" "I'll just take that," he said, and took hold of her handbag. "No!" Now there were 3 hands gripping the alligator bag, one of his and 2 of her own. "How dare you?" she said again, louder this time, knowing that everyone in the restaurant was looking at the 2 of them. Well, let them look. "You're not going anywhere," he told her. "By God, I was just going to take back what you stole, but you've got an attitude that's as bad as your thieving." He called over his shoulder, "Jimmy, call the precinct. Tell the guy on the desk to send over a couple of boys." His eyes glinted. Oh, he was enjoying this, and his words washed over her as he told her he would make an example of her, that a night or 2 in jail would give her more of a sense of private property. "Now," he said, "are you going to open that bag, or do we have to wait for the cops?" There were 2 policemen, one a good 10 years older than the other, though both looked young to her, and it was clear that neither of them wanted to be there, enlisted to punish a woman for stealing tableware from a cafeteria. It was the elder of the 2 who told her, almost apologetically, that she'd have to open the bag. "Certainly," she said, and worked the clasp, and took out the knife and the fork and both spoons. The policeman looked on with no change in expression, but the manager knew what he was seeing, and her heart quickened at the look on his face. "I like the food at this restaurant," she said, "and the people who dine here are decent, and the chairs are comfortable enough. But as for your spoons and forks, I don't care for the way they feel in my hands or in my mouth. I prefer my own. These were my mother's. They're hallmarked sterling silver. You can see her monogram." The apology came in a rush and found her unrelenting. It would be the manager's pleasure to give her a due bill entitling her to thus and so many meals absolutely without charge, and I'm sure nothing could induce me to come here ever again. Well, he was terribly sorry, and fortunately no actual harm had been done, so you've humiliated me in front of a room full of people. You laid hands on me, you grabbed my arm, you tried to grab my purse. She glanced around. Did you see what this man did? Several patrons nodded, including the woman who'd spooned all that sugar into her coffee. More words of apology, but she cut right through them. My nephew is an attorney. I think I should call him. Something changed in the manager's face. Why don't we go to my office? He suggested. I'm sure we can work this out. When she got back to her hotel, the first thing she did was pay her rent, the month that was overdue and the next 2 in advance. Upstairs in her room, she took the knife and fork and spoons and returned them to her dresser drawer. They were part of a set, all monogrammed with a capital J, but they had not been her mother's. Nor were they sterling. Had they been, she'd have contrived to sell them. But they were decent silver plate, and while she did not customarily carry them around with her, they served admirably when she warmed up a can of baked beans on her hot plate. And they'd served admirably today. In his office, the manager had tried to buy his way out with $100 and doubled it quickly when it was apparent he'd insulted her. A deep breath followed by a firm shake of her head had coaxed another 100 out of him, and she weighed that, hovering on the brink of accepting it, only to sigh and wonder if she wouldn't be best advised to call her nephew after all. His offer jumped from 300 to 500, and she had the sense he might well go higher, but Alfred had impressed upon her the folly of wringing every nickel out of a situation, so she didn't jump at it, but thought for a long moment and gave in gracefully. He had her sign something. She didn't hesitate, jotting down a name she'd used before, and he counted out the appointed sum in $20 bills, 25 of them, or 10,000 nickels, Liebchen, if you want to give the cashier a heart attack. But it went well, she told Alfred, speaking the words aloud in the little room. I pulled it off, didn't I? The answer to that was clear enough not to require his stating it. She hung her hat on the peg, her coat in the closet. She sat on the edge of the bed and counted her money, then tucked away all but one of the 20s where no one would think to look for them. Alfred had schooled her in hiding money, even as he'd taught her how to get hold of it. I couldn't be sure it would work, she said. It came to me one day. I had a fork with one bent tine, and I thought how low quality their cutlery was, and I could imagine a woman, one who'd come down a peg or two over time, bringing her own silverware in her purse. And then I forgot about her, and then she came back to me, and one thing led to another. And it had worked splendidly, and so the nervousness she'd felt had been appropriate to the role she'd been playing. Now, seeing the incident from a distance, viewing it with Alfred's critical perspective, she could see ways to refine her performance, to make more certain the taking of the bait and the sinking of the hook. Could she do it again? She wouldn't need to, not for quite a while. Her rent was paid through the end of the year, and the money she'd tucked away would keep her for that long and longer. Of course, she couldn't return to that particular automat. There were others, including a perfectly nice one very near to her hotel, but did the chain's managers keep one another up to date? The man she'd dealt with, the man with the thin lips and the mean little eyes, had hardly covered himself with glory in their encounter, and you'd think he'd want to keep it to himself. But one never knew, and the less one left to chance. Perhaps, for at least a while, she'd be well advised to take her custom elsewhere. There were many places nearby where the shabby genteel could dine decently at low cost. Childs, for example, had several restaurants, with a nice one nearby on 34th Street, in the shadow of the 3rd Avenue L. Or Schraff's. The prices were a little higher there, and they drew a better class of customer, but she'd fit in well enough. And if one of them had the right sort of manager, she'd know what to do when her funds got low. One had to adapt. She was too old to slip on a just-mopped floor at Gimbel's, too frail to stumble on an escalator. And there were all those routines Alfred had taught her, gambits you couldn't bring off without a partner. Schraff's, she decided. And she'd begin by scouting the one on West 23rd, in the heart of the Ladies' Mile. Would they have apple crisp? She hoped so.
That was Autumn at the Automat by Lawrence Block, read by Mary Wilson. It's from the anthology In Sunlight or in Shadow, a collection of short stories inspired by the paintings of Edward Hopper and edited by Lawrence Block. It also includes stories by Stephen King, Joyce Carol Oates, Robert Olin Butler, Michael Connolly, Lee Child, Megan Abbott, Joe R. Lansdale, and many more outstanding authors. You can get In Sunlight or in Shadow at Lawrence Block's website, lawrenceblock.com, at Amazon, and just about anywhere else you buy books. Mary Wilson is a reporter and producer at Slate's The Gist. Thank you for listening to Word Crimes. You can find complete show notes for this episode, including a link to the anthology In Sunlight or in Shadow, at wordcrimespodcast.com. All of our back episodes are also available and free at wordcrimespodcast.com, on iTunes, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you enjoy Word Crimes, please take a minute to rate us on iTunes. It makes us feel good, and you'll be helping other people learn about word crimes. We'd also love to hear from you on Twitter. You can find Mary Wilson on Twitter at Mary Wilson, and I'm there too at Eric Arneson. That's ErikArneson. You can also find me at ericarneson.com, where you can find information about my first book, a short story collection called The Throes of Crime. I'm also easy to find on Facebook. The music on this episode is by The Throes. You can find them at The Throes, THROES, thethroes.com. Thanks again for listening to Title 18, Word Crimes. We'll be back soon with more great crime fiction.